Hello, my name is Rochelle King, and I'm going to be presenting the characteristics of autism spectrum disorder. I first wanted to start with a discussion on what is autism spectrum disorder. Autism spectrum disorder is a neurological difference that is characterized by repetitive behavior patterns and deficits in communication that are not better described by an intellectual disability or a global delay. The DSM-5 criteria does note that one of the characteristics is for diagnostic is persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts. It does note restrictive and repetitive patterns of behaviors, interests, or activities. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual also says that these symptoms must be present in the early developmental period and cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of current functioning. Overall, these disturbances are not better explained by an intellectual disability or a global developmental delay. An intellectual disability and autism spectrum disorder can frequently co-occur together. To make comorbid diagnoses of autism spectrum disorder and intellectual disability, social communication should be below that expected for general developmental level. So now I want to talk about the etiologies of autism. So what are some of the frequently asked causes? What causes autism? There are quite a few theories on what causes autism. Research has been conducted in an attempt to identify the root causes. There's a lot of research going on right now. Research has included both internal and external factors. It has included genetic factors. It has included prenatal environmental factors, so what's going on with the mom, what's going on inside of the womb. It's also included physiology characteristics for causes, and I even saw one study that was looking at the occurrences of natural disasters amongst dense populations of autism occurrence. So here's what the research has found so far. There is a direct genetic correlation between the paternal genes and the occurrence of autism. So if autism occurs on the father's side, there is a greater likelihood of a couple having a child with autism. Autism is a neurological disorder. Some research cases have found that the shape of the brain and the occurrence of brain activity during certain cognitive functions are different than the brain of a typically developing peer. And there are some minor correlations between maternal habits during pregnancy and the occurrence of autism. Some of these maternal habits included drinking alcohol or smoking cigarettes or doing harder drugs. So what about vaccines? I want to state that there is no scientific evidence that vaccinations cause autism. The doctor who originally published those findings did lose his medical license because he published false findings. Also, the doctor who published those findings was later found out to have been paid by a lawyer, and that lawyer was attempting to enact a class action lawsuit against pharmaceutical companies. Now let's go ahead and talk about the neurological characteristics. This is what's going on in the brain. The characteristics of brains and autism. There has been research that shows that the volume of the brain actually has accelerated brain volume in the early years of development, and then the brain volume starts to decline after the ages between 10 and 15, depending on the person. There are also enlarged gyrus, or brain folds, in the frontal cortex of the brain, and there have been shown that there are atypically developing axons in the white matter of the brain. The axons are like the nerve endings that are connecting, and then the white matter is all the axons in between the gray matter of the brain, so all that stuff in between the folds. So what are the impacts of this? The brains in individuals with autism do show some structural and even functional abnormalities that can also affect the neuronal circuitry of the various brain regions. So because different parts of the brain are structured differently or act differently, it starts to affect how the normally or typically developing parts of the brains would function or should be shaped. Furthermore, structural and functional abnormalities may contribute to gross and fine motor impairments. It can also contribute to sleep disorders, comorbidities in ADHD, and epilepsy, and they can also contribute to emotional and behavioral difficulties. So like I said, sometimes one part of the brain is structured differently, and that's going to impact the rest of the brain, and those behaviors are then going to be seen as a result of that structural or volumetric abnormality. So now let's look at some of the cognitive characteristics. The cognitive is like the way that the brain is working, not the brain itself. So one study that I read did show that there was a decreased cognitive empathy and an increased emotional empathy for individuals with autism. Now what that means is that they are able to mimic the emotions that they see. So if you're mad, they can mimic being mad, but they don't understand why you're mad. That's the cognitive empathy part. So there's a lower understanding of the emotion, but a higher recognition of what the emotion is. Also, when we're taking a look at that, people with autism do have difficulty recognizing the emotion in facial expressions and the tone of voice. Even though they can mimic it, they're still not quite recognizing what the emotion is. That's the cognitive empathy part. So decreased cognitive empathy, increased emotional empathy. Now I'm going to talk about some of the behavioral and sensory characteristics of individuals with autism. One of the major things that a lot of people want to talk about when they're talking about autism is sensory processing disorder. Sensory processing disorder is the difficulty to process the input through your senses. Generally speaking, 5 to 6% of the general population will have SPD. 90% of individuals with autism have sensory processing disorder. This is very difficult for them to function when there is competing stimuli. So if it's too noisy, their eyes aren't going to be able to work because they're concentrating too much on that noise. If you give them a worksheet with too much visual stimuli, they're not going to be able to actually compute or comprehend what's going on. There's difficulty processing information through their senses. So there are 3 types of sensitivities. They can be hyposensitive, hypersensitive, or they can even have a mixed sensitivity. In a hyposensitive individual, you're going to see high neurological thresholds. So they require intense stimulation to even detect the sensory input. These are the kids that need the weighted blankets. And they have passive self-regulation strategies. They're failing to detect stimuli that others are able to perceive. So they're not going to notice those things in themselves. They might be considered indifferent. They might look as if they lack motivation or interest in initiating social relationships. They also might show an inability to recognize emotions, express emotions, or infer what other emotions are from their body language or facial expressions, but they may also lack a sense of humor. So when we're talking about strategies for a hyposensitive person, you just want to wake them up more. So have them run a lap, do some silly dances or some jumping jacks, just get them more in their body so that they are more awake and then they can act. A hypersensitive person is going to be overly sensitive to the competing stimuli that their brain receives. So we have one of 2 different subtypes. They can have a sensory avoidance or a sensory sensitivity. Now, sensory avoidance behaviors are going to just want to limit the stimuli. And if they're afraid of bright lights, they're never going to want to go out into the sunlight directly and without a smooth transition. These individuals may experience exclusion and social withdrawal because of these avoidance behaviors. Someone with sensory sensitivity They just might be identified in people, they have low neurological thresholds. They're passive self-regulation strategies who often experience distractibility and discomfort with sensation. These are the kids who have to cut up the tags out of their clothing. These are the kids who might have a lot of aversions to food because the physical sensation in their mouth is too much for them. So these individuals might become aggressive and have negative reactions to sensory stimuli. Their brains literally cannot function and process the information that they're receiving. So it might be too intense, it might be overwhelming, and it at times can be painful and actually feel invasive. The third type of sensitivity is mixed sensitivities. These individuals could be hypersensitive to one specific stimuli and then hyposensitive to others. For example, they may not want to eat different foods due to the texture, but if they're in a loud room, they can hear all the noise, but they can also read their book and comprehend everything that's going on. Since we're talking about sensory behaviors, I want to mention stimming. Stimming in an autistic person is where they are going to show repetitive self-soothing behaviors. Stimming literally stands for self-stimulation. So things that you're going to want to look for in stimming, it might look like the child is rocking back and forth, or they might be flapping their arms or twisting their arms. They might drum on a desk, and they might jump up and down. Noises can also be stimming. You might have a student who likes to tap their fingers on the desk, or they have to crinkle a paper by their ears to hear the crinkling noises, or they themselves might be producing odd noises at odd times. This is to soothe themselves, and that's stimming. When you stop a person from stimming, you are stopping them from actually being able to soothe themselves, and it can become painful if they're not able to express that sensation that they need to in order to process the other stimuli that's going on around them. Okay, language and speech communication. This is another area of autism that is receiving a lot of attention. So when we're talking about communication, a person with autism is going to have difficulty understanding nonverbal communication, such as body language. They're also going to have difficulty understanding when and how to appropriately respond in social interactions. These are the people who are going to be standing in front of the slide and just standing there, and the kids are trying to get their turns. They don't know how to appropriately respond and say, oh, you can go next, or turn taking. They do have trouble developing and understanding and maintaining relationships with others because they don't know how to initiate those appropriate interactions. When we're looking at the speech patterns, they can show with pronoun reversal. It can show as echolalia, where they repeat what somebody has said, or they repeat their own phrases over and over. They can have a reduced or even reversed production comprehension lag. What that means is they're going to have a higher receptive speech and a much lower expressive speech. They can understand a lot more than they can say. Or they're going to have really high speech, but they don't understand any of what they're saying or reading. In severe cases, a person with autism might not be able to verbally communicate. And so they're addressing these deficits by providing augmented and alternative communication devices, communication boards, speech generating devices, and PECS boards. These are all different strategies that are used that provide a form of communication for the person with autism to be able to communicate with other people. Social characteristics. They're going to have high emotional empathy, low cognitive empathy, lack of ability to communicate with their peers. They need peers that are patient. They're not going to have a lot of patient peers around them. They may like to play around others, but not necessarily with others. Schools can actually do a lot to help with interventions. They can write specific social goals into their IEP and provide increased time in the general education classroom. There has been a lot of research that shows that that is going to positively impact a person with autism. So we can provide social stories, video modeling, video self-modeling, IEP goals, peer buddies, and even peer social groups. So one last word. If you've seen one person with autism, you've seen one person with autism. They have a lot more obstacles to overcome than the normal person. They still want to be loved. They still want to be included. So include them. And here are all of my